It is the experiences of trafficking we cannot see that go unnoticed. It is the words we have not learned yet that keep us silent. And it is the aspects of freedom we do not define that remain unprotected. The price of surrendering our freedom is deeper than we think. For freedom is a necessity for progress, a necessity for survival. Without it, we lose our inner freedom, our self-direction and autonomy, the qualities that distinguish human beings from robots and computers. For the next couple moments, I want you to relax. Relax. Take a deep breath, actually. Yeah, loosen up, be in your chair. Take a deep breath. Actually, let's all take a deep breath together, actually. Deep breath in and out. Oh, wow, this isn't just for you, it's for me too, I'm nervous. One more time, deep breaths in and out. Today, I'm going to take the advice of Margaret Wheatley. I'm going to be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. In his book, Freedom and Destiny, Rollo May, a brilliant existential psychologist, pointed out something so interesting. That right now, in our country, there is a general experience of suppressed panic. Anxiety not only about our individual lives and finances, but about uncontrolled inflation, unemployment. Anxiety that our old values have deteriorated as our religions have eroded. About our disintegrating family structure, concern of pollution in the air, politics, and literally everything else. There's a lot to deal with these days. And while some folks do their best to appear unaffected by their anxieties, their substance abuse and mental health tell a different story. This is precisely what we all do in one way or another. We suppress our anxieties with the handiest of substitutes. We use our phones, social media, sports, and so many other things as emotional distractions. These things aren't bad, but they continuously allow us to dull our reactions. The frightening facts of reality is we're going through those things. We like things that emotionally distract us because they allow us to temporarily forget. For instance, Netflix helps us forget about the quiet panic we feel when we think about the large amounts of debt we had no choice but to borrow for survival. Facebook helps us forget most Americans are no longer considered middle class. We're just doing our best. That a lot of us are really one paycheck away from losing everything. And millions of us are 2 late checks away from being on the street. Instagram is my favorite because it allows us young people to distract ourselves from the feelings of loneliness and unhappiness that keep us up at night. Twitter's the opposite. People are honest on Twitter. It's so interesting. Twitter's the Wild West of social media, It's like this unholy realm between earth and hell where you can go remind yourself just how depressed and angry everyone is. But there's something cathartic about it. That's why we like it. There's something so validating about reading someone else admit, I'm fine, I'm just not happy. With all the tremendous pressures to exceed in life, be successful, stay away from the poverty line, and be nice to ourselves and others, there's something psychologically magical about admitting, this is hard. I'm doing my best, but I still feel overwhelmed and afraid. This is not what I expected. I'm grateful, but I want more. Friends, as the world moves into its next era, we're only going to feel this more and more intensely. The cost of living will only go up. Student loan debt will only increase, and high-paying jobs will only get more competitive. Those seemingly at the top will find themselves lower, while the families trying to stay afloat above the poverty line will quickly slip under. Are you seeing where I'm getting at? I'm trying to warn everyone. Every year we become more vulnerable to looking less like this to more like this. I asked all of you here today because I'm nervous, and I think you should be too. It's a slippery slope. The fewer opportunities we have to a good education, the less likely we are to high-paying jobs. Fewer high-paying jobs means we must accept lower jobs with smaller wages just to survive. The smaller our incomes, the less money we have, thus fewer options we have in life. And as the cost of living increases, so will the number of jobs we'll need to stay on top of everything. The more hours we work in a week, the less time we spend at home. Pause. In 2019, a lot of us are already at this point. And hopefully, this is where we'll stop and try to figure out ways to make life easier for ourselves. But for many families, their fall doesn't stop there. Some people are never able to find that second or third job. Others aren't able to pay off their debts fast enough. Some mothers are never able to magically make ends meet. They never seem to catch a break. They just keep falling. Falling into homelessness, crime, risky lifestyles, sex work, and eventually falling into the hands of a trafficker. When parents are falling into these realities, guess where their children land? As I said, I'm nervous because I know that human trafficking is the world's fastest growing business. And I know that it will only expand as a lot more people become more vulnerable. That is the reason for this conversation. Our lens to freedom is just my way of bringing up the fact that we're all a little more vulnerable to slavery than we like to think, which means our freedom is at risk. I'll put it this way. If the presence of human trafficking is ever present in our society, then it is apparent that there is still an issue of freedom that we have yet to protect for all people. And the only way to protect ourselves is to understand what freedom is, how we experience it, and what it looks like. What if we tried to understand freedom so hard we could learn to see it? What if we tried to understand freedom so we can measure it? As of now, the Oxford Dictionary defines freedom as the state or fact of being free from servitude, constraint, inhibition. This definition's okay, but it doesn't tell us what it's supposed to feel like or what it means to be free. It just describes how we should expect to feel once we are free. In my opinion, this definition is too vague, it's outdated, and it's not sufficient enough to handle the complexities of today's reality of freedom. Right now, there are hundreds of different definitions of freedom, each trying to hit the nail on its head. I'm a huge fan of Rollo May, so I think he captured the essence of human trafficking, of freedom perfectly in his book, Freedom and Destiny. He wrote, "Freedom is the possibility of changing." To be able to discriminate between possibilities and keep different options in one's mind, even though it is not clear at the moment which way one must act. Freedom is much like health, virtue, or innocence. We feel it most intensely after we've lost it. I'm sure his idea of freedom is different than what came to mind for you, and that's kind of my point. We can't agree because we simply haven't figured it out yet. Still to this day, we do not have a standard legal definition of modern freedom, but we have one for modern slavery. My concern is what happens if we never figure one out, and how our lack of understanding of modern freedom affects our fight against modern slavery. So I began to ask some questions, like, what is freedom? Why do we assume everyone is free? Why can't we see victims? Here's what I found. As I mentioned before, our lack of explicit legal language on what makes someone free beyond the context of prison, human trafficking, and or slavery has negatively influenced the way Americans perceive freedom. As a result, we do not accurately question our own freedom regularly, and the definitions we use typically fail to include the mechanics of autonomy and our severe constraints. Our nation's definition of freedom, grounded in our creed of freedom and justice for all, is highly undefined as its own legal definition. We've only been able to build metrics to measure our experiences of freedom from this assumed definition. What's missing from our discussions of freedom is that we are currently experiencing two different forms of freedom. The freedom we experience today exists in the gap between our perceived rights and our experienced rights. The first form, perceived rights, are the rights and freedoms every citizen is assumed to possess and enjoy. For perceived rights, the problem lies in our assumption that we're all on the same page. Well, it's kind of like when we say all Americans have equal rights, right? But if you flick through a couple pages in a history book, well, anyone learns that that's not exactly true. The second form, experienced rights, are the individual rights and freedoms we are able to benefit from the most. Or in some cases, they are the only rights afforded to us by your identities and your privileges. To understand what freedom is, we must acknowledge the things we think we can do versus what we can do. That's step one. And step two is to understand how freedom is experienced by others. Why? Because we each experience our freedom differently. It is a fact that some people experience more or less freedom primarily due to their life constraints. Now, let me explain what I mean by life constraints. Let's try this. Everyone should have been given a rope before they sat down, right? Let's take that rope and let's do a quick exercise to figure out what are your constraints. Can I get a rope, please? Here's a rope. Thank you so much. All right. So hold the rope like so. Like this. And it's simple. I'm going to read you a quick series of statements. And if the statement for you is false, take one side of the string and wrap it around your hand. Okay? I'll repeat it. I'm going to read a couple of statements. If the statement for you is false, take one line, and wrap it around your hand. All right? Easy as that. Everyone ready? All right, cool. Here's the first statement. My gender is least likely to experience sexual violence. Statement number two. I can afford to visit a healthcare professional multiple times a year. I have a bachelor's degree or higher. I only need one job to afford my bills, groceries, rent, mortgage, etc. My race or sexual orientation will not make people around me uncomfortable. I do not suffer from any physical or mental health issues. I can walk around my neighborhood alone at night without legitimate concern for my safety. Okay, let's stop there. Now, whichever side is loose, take your other hand and try to find the gap like this. Everyone got it? Cool, cool, cool. This is what you're working with. The space between your hands represents how your experience rights and your identities actually affect how much freedom you have. Look at your gap and compare it to others around you. How are you more or less free than the people in your row? Those are ways we can begin to try to understand our ideas of freedom and how we measure. A life example of this is as simple as the common knowledge that women shouldn't walk alone at night due to their high risk of sexual harassment, assault, and even rape. Logically, there is no reason why a woman can't walk alone at night. But we as a society understand far too well her safety is placed in danger. A lot of women avoid being alone at night because they do not feel like they have that freedom. Men largely share that freedom and don't even think twice about it. We just step outside. Keeping in mind the idea of our constraints, imagine how hard your life would be if you only had about this much to work with. If a woman is homeless or a sex worker, then she has even more constraints to her choice making. She'll be more focused on how she will survive the night than how she can get ahead. The more constraints we have in our lives, the more impaired our choice making becomes. More constraints put us at higher risk. And the higher the risk, the more vulnerable we are to trafficking. Because traffickers prey on individuals in situations such as this. It is far easier to recruit, manipulate, and coerce a victim with limited freedom. All they have to do is offer something a person cannot give themselves: food, shelter, romance, just hope. The reality of our flawed perceptions of understanding victims comes from our lack of understanding of freedom. Which brought me to my next question. Why do we assume everyone is free? A society with arbitrary and unequal experiences of freedom allows individuals with the most constraints to be targeted by traffickers first. We can't even rely on established policy anymore. Even citizenship doesn't inherently promise freedom. It is the responsibility of an individual to protect their freedom, yes. But it is also the responsibility of a government to protect the experienced freedom of its citizens. And the best way to do so is through anti-trafficking policy. To accurately question if the possibility of limited freedom experienced by those around us, we as a culture need to readjust our critical lenses of how we perceive freedom. To ask oneself, am I experiencing freedom in accordance to the highest value of my own self-interest would be weird. But for those fighting to survive, it is the question we ask ourselves over and over in situations. The more we are aware of our constraints in this way, the faster we'll stop assuming we're all on the same page. We need to shift our view of freedom, which is what I hope to encourage you to do today. We need to challenge ourselves to look for things we normally miss, such as victims of human trafficking. Which brings me to my last question. Why can't we see victims? Did you know many child victims of human trafficking are students in the American school system? They are the victims attending school every day that no one notices. Victims around us every day. And because we've been shown so many images of women handcuffed to bed frames, we think, well, certainly no one around me is going through that. We unintentionally assume that everyone is free because, well, we're so comfortable in our own lives that we can't even imagine ourselves as a statistic. We are experiencing trouble in identifying those in slavery because we haven't truly identified the free. When we walk throughout our days, we observe and examine everything we see through analytical lenses. We become dependent upon them to understand all the aspects of life we encounter. By a raise of hands, how many of you have bought a car? Isn't it odd that right after you start driving around, you realize everyone has the same car as you? Like before, you might have noticed one, but after you started driving, you started seeing all of them. It's weird. It's not like those cars didn't exist before you got it, right? Those cars were always there. You just weren't seeing them. But once those cars became your car, you couldn't ignore it if you tried. It's just how our minds work. We are experts at visually seeking information. When looking at others with just a glance, we download massive amount of data with which our mind processes using observation tools we've adopted. But that goes to say we cannot perceive information we cannot observe visually. And even if visual, we will continuously miss the information we do not learn to look for. This primarily is the issue of identifying victims of human trafficking. It is difficult or impossible to see the effects of human trafficking when most aspects are not inherently visible to the eye. It's for these reasons we rely on testimonies and accounts from victims to fill in the gaps of information we cannot get from sight alone. Yet, from this reliance on testimony, many victims are confused with criminals. Their trauma forces them to hide their truth, just as traffickers hid them from society. This may sound backward, I understand. But one of the many reasons we cannot see slavery is because we do not look for freedom. In our everyday, we judge and measure everything we see in comparison to ourselves because we are programmed to be hyper-aware of our self-identity, status, and differences. And since the questions we ask ourselves are derived from our own self-interests These questions typically reveal things about ourselves that lie closest to our individual truth and experiences. We tend to ask specific questions to discover similarities in others that validate the differences we face in life. Yet it is rare we question if someone else is free because it is the very question people ask themselves the least. If we began to have more open discussions of identifying the free and the constraints that impair our choice making, we could then adjust our culture to seek victims rather than ignore them. We could begin to build our lens to freedom, to identify the free, to see the unseen. I think we should all be freedom advocates because we are all a little more vulnerable to slavery than we think. Thank you.